So thank you for listening to this. I'm sorry that I can't be here today. My name's Corinne Fowler and I'm Associate Professor at the University of Leicester, and I'm currently seconded to the National Trust as a Global Connections Fellow. And I'm going to be asked questions by my project manager, Kevin Ncube, who works for BBC Radio Leicester also.
Corinne, first and foremost, what National Trust houses, what do they have to do with Empire?
Well, I think that Empire is not the first thing that springs to mind when people think about National Trust places, but actually they've got an awful lot to do with Empire in lots of unexpected ways. Some of those connections are really direct, and you can imagine that maybe there's one or two slavery connections, but there are also connections to the East India Company, to China through Chinese wallpapers, and so on. And so even in the Midlands, recently there was a survey done by the University of Birmingham, and they looked at 24 Midlands properties. They checked them for slavery connections, partly through using the Legacies of British Slave Ownership database, which was something which was put together by the British government to give slave owners compensation after abolition. And they found that a large proportion of those Midlands properties had connections to slavery, to slave ownership, to the transatlantic slave trade, to money which was inherited, or money which was transmitted through marriage to heiresses or so on. But they also found that a large proportion of those same properties also had East India Company connections. And so that could be through similar examples, but sometimes through marriage, sometimes people worked for the East India Company, and so on. I mean, the National Trust as a whole, there are loads of big stories, big, strong, bold, obvious stories. So, for example, you've got Penrhyn Castle, which has been called by the historian Marion Gwynne a slavery landscape. And that's because the roads, the railways, even the slate mine and the port were all funded partly by slave-produced sugar wealth from the Clarendon plantations in Jamaica. And then you've got other places which are less obvious, because a lot of this activity happened off stage, overseas. You have places like Speke Hall, which is a Tudor property and seems to have nothing to do with Empire, but actually it was bought by Richard Watt I, and Richard Watt I used to be a hackney carriage driver in Liverpool, but he then went over to Jamaica and ended up making a fortune through involvement in every single aspect of the slave trade, from investing in slave ships to owning plantations in Jamaica to having a rum and sugar shipping business. So with that money he then bought the hall. His relatives who inherited the money then restored it generation on generation, and the last in the line, Adelaide Watt, then gave the house to the National Trust. So the house probably wouldn't really be standing, and it wouldn't be in the state that it's in if it were not for slavery. But then the East India Company stories are also strong. You've got Basildon Park, for example, which was bought by Sir Francis Sykes, who made a fortune with the East India Company, and when he came back he used some of that money to buy Basildon Park and some other places, and he built Basildon Park with it. So there's lots and lots of examples like that.
Absolutely, lots of examples there, and there's a lot in there, Corinne. But before we unpack, what you've just said, explain your role.
So my role at the National Trust came about because I had a project called Colonial Countryside, which is a child-led history and writing project focusing on precisely the kinds of topics that I've been speaking about earlier. And it was a very good way, although it was a fairly small project, it's a £160,000 Heritage Lottery Arts Council project, But that project has allowed the National Trust to start talking more openly about these kinds of colonial connections. And it seemed a good opportunity to say, well, this has worked really well. Visitors are quite intrigued by some of the very unfamiliar stories that are coming out of National Trust places, and so it was a good opportunity for me to start supporting the Trust to help it to think about all of its 6 regions, about how curators can respond to research that's been done in this area, how volunteers can respond, and what kind of training is required.
You sound like you enjoy it.
I love it. It's absolutely amazing. But I think that the important thing to say is that although the Trust in the past maybe was a bit worried about what visitors might think about some of these connections, what people are finding is it's incredibly fascinating and also quite enriching for everybody.
If I may interject there, you kind of preempted my next question, which would have been, why hasn't the National Trust spoken about it before?
Well, there are a number of reasons. First of all, I don't think there was always an appetite for tackling what is actually quite a big topic. Secondly, because the research was not really opening up these histories until recently. So recent changes in British imperial history mean that the National Trust now has a lot more information about how its places more precisely are connected to empire. And these stories are coming out bit by bit. Just over the last 10 years or so, there's been a shift in British imperial history from broader focus on the empire and the outposts of empire to home, what's happening at home, what was happening in upper class settings, in domestic settings, what was happening in Britain, how was it shaped by empire. And so these sorts of questions and new databases like the Legacies of British Slave Ownership database, new projects like the East India Company at Home project at UCL in London, all of these have given us a whole load of new information that we didn't have before. But I think there are other reasons too. We've got an Everyone Welcome programme now, and Everyone Welcome is about making everybody feel welcome, and that might mean non-traditional visitors who perhaps have family connections to former colonial countries, who might find these stories really fascinating and particularly relevant to them. And so one of the propositions that we have is that you sort of effect a shift from thinking about country houses as local houses to thinking about them as global houses. It opens up a whole new load of histories which are fascinating to everybody, but which might have particular relevance for visitors who don't traditionally come to National Trust places. And this is what I found with the Colonial Countryside project, that I had a child on that project called Zaskia. Well, I've got to tell you about Zaskia because Zaskia is of Indian heritage, and she was fascinated by a miniature painting of Tipu Sultan in Chalkot Park. And when she saw that miniature, she was only 10 years old at the time, but she started reading about the British Empire because she had Indian family connections. And eventually she made her parents go to India. She asked them to go to Tipu Sultan's palace. They went to the palace and she started reflecting on history and how history is presented to us. So she said, she came back, she said to me, if you're a British historian, you talk about how Tipu Sultan was defeated by the East India Company. If you're a Muslim curator, which is who she came across when she visited Tipu Sultan's palace, then they tell you that he was a great hero and that he revived the infrastructure of India so that he could set up trade with China and other countries. And then if you talk to Modi's government, or she talked to the taxi driver, she told me, the taxi driver said, he was a villain, Tipu Sultan, because he converted people to Islam. So she said, that's in a nutshell the different versions you get of history depending on your standpoint. Anyway, I thought this child was brilliant because she made her mother send me interpretation panels from this Tipu Sultan's palace, and in the end I took her to the British Museum annual conference and she told them all of this without any notes, and she said, well, I'm only 11, because she was a year older by then. She said, I'm only 11 and I forged an international collaboration, which is true because of the way that she thinks.
Wow.
Because she's thinking of country houses as global things, that she's able to make those connections.
So she
and
forged
she went and spoke to the museum, and she's forged this connection, which is very useful for Paris Castle. They laughed and clapped and cheered her. I think some people were really moved at the enthusiasm. Well, normally presenters at the conference are seasoned heritage professionals, so it was pretty unusual to have a child speaking. But it's lovely to see that kind of enthusiasm, and the way that she thinks, and the 100 other children I worked with, is globally, and so they were able to make those connections in ways that we can't.
So just to backtrack, a brief overview of the Colonial Countryside project would be that it's a child-led history project, and they're looking at these stately homes and sort of challenging histories through a local lens, would that be?
Yeah, so it's trying to understand the history of empire through a local history lens. It's a really interesting way of looking at our connections to empire today. So, for example, at Durham Park, that's a 17th century story of colonialism. You had William Blathwaite there, who was a very important colonial administrator in his time. And what he did was, his job was to make the colonies profitable. And so instead of relying on subsidies from London, they were actually becoming self-sustaining and bringing money into Britain. And there are fascinating stories that the children explored to do with that. So, for example, although William Blathwaite never travelled to the colonies himself, he was constantly in correspondence with all these governors over there. And they would do things like send him seeds in packets, literally the seeds of empire, and he would plant them in his garden, grow them. They'd make these beautiful exotic flowers, and then he'd put them in vases for visitors to admire. And there's one plant which has been grafted so many times, it's a tree, that it still exists from that time. Mm-hmm. But there are other very interesting things there. So, for example, the children looked at a Delft tile in the hallway, and that tile depicts Chinese plants and palm trees and things like that. But it was made in Delft, Holland, painted there, but it was based on an East India Company account of a visit to the Chinese embassy. So these sorts of objects are transcultural objects, and it starts making you think about country houses in completely different ways.
Well, these children have started thinking and talking about country houses in completely different ways. I must admit, I distinctly remember some tweets from these young historians that have had huge reaction on social media. I think the most follows you got might have been, do you have the stats? For one of the children who told her?
Was with the video made by a child that you recorded actually at Penryn Castle. The child was talking about an idealised watercolour depiction of a plantation in Jamaica, the Clarendon plantations, which the Pennant family at that castle owned. And she was talking about it and I think we put it on Twitter, and she got something like 870 retweets or something. It was ridiculous. It was a really popular video, but it was brilliant, because what she did was she stood in front of this picture and she talked about the Pennant family and their connection to the plantations, and she then said, well, it wasn't like this in the picture where the sun's shining. Maybe the sun would be shining, but everybody's well dressed. All the enslaved people are happily and gently toiling in the fields with nobody coercing them to do anything. And she just she deconstructed the picture basically and analysed it. And it was a very popular and informative video.
Corinne, yours must be a 48-hour day. I mean, taking these kids who might often felt alienated from the countryside here, There's also your global consultant, the fellow stuff you do with the National Trust. There's the stuff in academia. How do you fit it all in?
Oh, it just runs on passion, really, because the more you look at this, the more fascinating it is. And it's also because it's an area which requires some diplomacy, because there are sensitivities around these subjects. And what I really enjoy is just reassuring people that when something is part and parcel of the history of the house, when it's not just a side issue, when it's something which is actually quite central to the house's history, that there's no need to be afraid of it, and that, as I said before, it enriches us all to understand our history, warts and all. And that's been a really fascinating part of it, just watching people responding to that and being creative and very careful and sensitive in the way that they address these histories. So Hanbury Hall, where many of the volunteers here are working in that house, they have some sensitive objects, and those objects are the African stands, which are, it looks like two boys, but it's actually two girls. But most people just walk past those, but some people see them and get a really strong reaction to them, because it's a depiction of African women in a subordinate position, dressed in clothes which have nothing to do with their original culture, which was, how it was at the time. And so it's really interesting thinking through, well, how can we link this to all the other things in the house which tell us intriguing things about the British Empire during that period and onwards. So, there's a lot to be learned in thinking through some of the dilemmas which some of our objects, some of our collections present us with. But again, there's no need to shy away from it. It's a big question of solving and getting an approach which works for everybody.
The literature before me says you visited Chalcot Park, and some of the objects were the Indian sword and a black page. The reaction from the children was fascinating, to say the least, about who you might have been. Could you expand for me there? So
at Chalcot Park, when you walk into the hall, it's easy to miss, but there's a portrait of Captain Lucy with a black page boy holding his horse, and the boy is just at the edge of the picture. So when the Colonial primary children saw that painting, they were very interested in the position of this boy right at the edge of the painting, and they wrote poems and short personal essays about that. But they also looked at the documentary evidence which suggests that he was actually called Will Arches, or had been given the name Will Arches, and he appears in the parish records around the time that portrait was done. And they were also intrigued by what the wider ramifications were. So we visited a gravestone in the local cemetery at Oxhill and found a grave to a woman called Myrtilla, who was taken from Nevis by other slave-owning families in the region. The people at Chalcot were not slave owners, as far as we know, but there was a very strong black presence in the area. We've got records of a couple of slave sales in Lichfield, for example. So these tell stories that might be unexpected to some people, that there was a black presence in Warwickshire during that period in the 17th and 18th century.
There's a guidebook with an interesting word search, a treasure map, and the like, all to do with Chalcot. It brings together some of the most important treasures at Chalcot Park. True or false, your group is rewriting these guidebooks? Yeah. So Colonial Primary has come across a guidebook which was written 13 years or so ago by a project called Whose Story? ? And it looked at some of the objects in Chalcot Park that link to empire.
So there's an Indian dress sword, for example, which was stolen during the First War of Indian Independence, or, you know, as the British called it, Indian Mutiny, or you could call it the 1857 conflict. And it takes you through all these different items in the house, including
the Black Page Boy.
The Black Page Boy and the Tipu Sultan miniature. And so the children, originally that book was for children by adults, and it was well researched and everything, but now we want it written by children for children and for adults. It's nice to have children writing for adults as well in an informative way. And they've done something similar at Penrhyn Castle, where the children have written a trail of about 10 or so colonial objects which are placed at various points through the house.
The next two questions are going to be quite grilling. Rural racism, it's been written about widely and also on social media. What would your take be on that?
Yeah,
Might that
I think
have been part of your inspiration to investigate?
Yeah, I think so. In a colleague of mine called Neil Chakrabarty has written a book with an author called John Garland called Rural Racism. And what may be surprising is that they found that incidents of racism are proportionally more common in the countryside than in cities, and that's partly because people don't necessarily expect a black presence in the countryside. And so they did a whole study of it, statistical analysis of reports of racism and so on. And I think what it all boils down to is that the countryside is very much seen as representing the soul of Britain, especially England, and that it's sort of a repository of all our old traditional values of neighbourliness and kindness and small village life. We've got a whole poetic tradition which has sprung up around it. And what maybe some of this historical evidence does is it disrupts the idea that the British countryside has always been a white space, but it hasn't. And there's even a book, Black Tudors, which shows a rural black presence. There are 10 chapters in there, each detailing the lives of people that the historian Miranda Kaufman came across in the historical records.
How about the criticism or castigation that this might be a whitewashing of history?
I think I would say the opposite, that what has been done until now is potentially sanitising history and not talking about, or maybe averting our eyes from some of the things we don't necessarily want to look at about our national past. But what I would say to that is that it's really important to understand that these are shared histories. So, for example, my family, although I didn't know this until recently, were slave owners, and they owned a plantation in Haiti. So my family profited, my family are French, by the way, that they profited from the slave trade and from plantation. The slave produced sugar wealth in particular. Whereas other people have histories which link to slavery or to the Indian, the British Empire in India, and so there are other sides to that. There's always another side, but the point is that we shouldn't confuse heritage and the idea of enjoying yourself in a heritage site. Having fun, which is really important, and the account of history that we give, because we do have a duty to follow the evidence. And so long as everything we talk about is evidence-based, so long as it is a significant part of the story, I think we have a duty as heritage professionals and volunteers and so on to tell that story.
What would your message be from your heart to theirs? I'm talking about the volunteers at these National Trust properties.
Just enjoy the process that we're going on. Get involved if you're interested, and I think that it's a fascinating journey, and I as I say, this whole thing runs on passion as well as on rational, evidence-based stuff. So I would just say it's a whole world of new information which can be extremely stimulating and enriching.
Anything else you'd like to say?
No, I'm looking forward to. I'm just looking forward to meeting some of you as volunteers when I'm going around Hanbury Hall sometimes. And thank you for your attention.